Hi everyone, it's your book coach Liisa Kovala here. Grab a cup of coffee and settle in for a discussion about all things writerly. I'm the author of Sister's Winter War and Surviving Stutthof, my father's memories behind the death cave, and I'm an author accelerator, certified fiction, and memoir book coach. As a Finnish Canadian, I also love my coffee. In this podcast, we'll take a coffee break together to chat with authors, publishers, book coaches, marketers, agents, publicists, booksellers, and many others. Welcome to Women Writing. So happy you could join us for a coffee and a chat. In today's episode of Women Writing, I am joined by Alissa Butterworth. She is an author, editor, certified book coach, and educator. She has taught creative writing to teens through seniors and holds a longstanding writer's workshop. Alissa is particularly interested in helping students discover or rediscover their own voices and gifts. She is also the author of a debut novel, To Die is Different Than Supposed, which was published in February 2025 through River Grove Books. Hi, Alissa. How are you?
Good. How are you, Lisa?
I'm so good. Thanks for taking a coffee break with me. Are you a coffee drinker or tea drinker?
I'm actually a tea drinker.
Okay. Favorite tea?
Irish breakfast, I think.
Oh, nice. I like.
Although there's a local tea room that has a French vanilla creme brulee that I got a small bag of that I've been treating myself to from time to time.
Love that. Yum. And I like an Earl Grey. Nice.
A little too floral for me, but
okay. See, I think that, there's so many options. It's nice that you can, but I tend to still stick with coffee most of the time. I kind of do.
I love the smell of coffee, but the taste of it has never done it for me.
Yeah, it's either you love it or hate it, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So you are a writer and a book coach, and you do lots of programs. What got you into book coaching?
So for me, book coaching really is a natural extension of the work I was already doing with my writers. For almost 10 years now, I've been teaching a longstanding writers workshop. And in addition to that, I teach other classes. I do editorial work, developmental editing. And so one of the things I love my workshop to death, but there's not necessarily an opportunity to work with writers over the long term.
Right.
A term might be 4 to 8 weeks long, and then folks kind of go off on their own. And I do have a lot of repeat students who join our workshop, which is great. And that gives the opportunity for people working on book length works to check in with people who are familiar with their piece. But the opportunity, I think, to help somebody develop their book or a book length project over a longer period was really what interested me in book coaching. And so I kind of investigated it. I thought, hey, this sounds really good. And so, I was certified as a book coach about a year ago. Right after I was certified, I made a big move from New England to the Mid-Atlantic. So I would say within the last probably 6 months, my book coaching has really started to take off, which has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, amazing. And a lot of big changes then in the last couple years.
100%. Yep.
Yeah, it's a lot, but so exciting. And so tell us about that program that you developed that you've been doing for 10 years. So you have these writers workshops. What does that look like and who participates?
Sure. So I initially started teaching a writer's workshop because I was invited to by a community ed program up in New England where I used to live. And so that was the opportunity for me really to develop a workshop however I wanted to. The criteria was basically to have a workshop. And so when I say workshop, I mean a critique workshop as opposed to, you go and you learn about craft or something, although we do that as well. And so I just had the opportunity to kind of think about all the workshops that I've been in as a writer, that I've had my work critiqued and also that I've led, and to kind of think about what was most successful and what I found less successful, and to start to develop a model for how I wanted to do it. And I think it's been pretty successful so far. I mean, we have folks who started in my very first session who still take the class.
That's amazing.
Who still join us term after term. And we've really developed a strong sense of community as well, which is really important to me. I tell folks I work with all the time that I feel that writing is a very lonely vocation. So find community where you can. And I think one of the things I'm proudest of in developing the workshop that I do is that sense of community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how we can, spend so many hours on the page or on the screen on our own. But when you're kind of with other people doing that work and understand that your feelings about it are valid and other people are feeling the same way,
Sure.
it's so important. It's amazing you've created that. And the fact that your people are probably looking forward to the next one. Like they're always like, this is something
Yeah, yeah.
new.
No, I get, yep, emails, but when's our next term? What are we thinking about dates?
Oh,
And it's great too because, there's a core group of folks who return term after term, but then we always get new faces,
yes.
which is also really nice because, whether people are with us for a season or for many, it's great to have that interaction. And the workshop that I teach is multi-genre and multi-level and multi-stage of the writing process,
Okay.
which is a little bit different from a lot of workshops that folks might enroll in. I feel like a lot of workshops tend to be either, for poets or for writers who have a completed book or for people who are working on short stories or whatever it might be. And I think those are great. What's successful, I think, though, about the multi-genre and multi-stage, I'll call it for lack of a better phrase, is that there's a lot of learning that goes on between people who work on different things.
Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it's true, right? Like even though it might be really different genres, that conversation can really bring up new ideas for each of them that they can do
100%.
their own project. That's a really fascinating thing. I see that too with my groups. Often there might be novelists and memoirists, and there's so much overlap
Sure.
that you don't really
Hmm.
anticipate. But then when the conversation is going, you think, yeah. That is something you can learn from each other. It's amazing. So did you say that there's craft involved, but there's some critiquing?
Sure. So
Yeah.
the primary work of the workshops that I teach is student critiquing of one another's work. It's conversations that I lead, so it's very directed.
Yeah.
If you think about like the traditional workshop model that you hear, like the 1930s Iowa, where the writer sits silently, that's not quite the model that I've developed. I don't like the idea of a writer sitting and having no say in what's happening.
Fair.
So while I do practice a quiet writer policy, so the writer doesn't talk during the discussion, that's not to silence them. It's actually just to allow them to sit and listen to the conversation. Because I feel like it's difficult when you're sitting in a group of people and they say, Lisa, I really liked page 10 where the dialogue gets into the thing about the grammar, whatever it might be. I think it's easier for somebody to listen if they're say, on page 10, I really like this. Because as soon as your name is involved,
Mhm.
your brain goes in a different direction.
That's interesting.
And so for me, the quiet writer policy is not to silence writers, but to allow them to pay attention deeply.
Yeah. I like that
And
reframing of it for sure.
mhm.
That's
and so my writers have several ways then that their voice is represented within the workshop. First, before every workshop, because we do follow, the traditional, you send your work out the week before. Everybody has a week to respond to it in writing, and then they bring their notes to discuss. I send all of my writers just a simple Google form. And when we used to meet in person before COVID many years ago, and it was, a form that they would fill out by hand when they submitted their work. But it's essentially always asked the same thing, which is where is this in the writing process? What was the process of getting this ready for workshop like? What are you most proud of in this piece? What would you like to help with? What kind of feedback would be most useful to you?
yeah.
And so once I have that guidance from the writer, it really helps me to shape a set of questions and a set of criteria that I make sure our discussion stays within.
That's really
And so, if somebody is really concerned about line breaks on the third poem or the dialogue scene between the mom and the dad or whatever it might be, we can really make sure that we discuss that. And the way that I like to structure it too is, discussions go off in lots of different directions, and that's fine. And that's part of the fun of these discussions. But at the same time, I'm able to sort of have guardrails and guide the discussion back to make sure that the writer is getting the sort of feedback that would be most useful to them.
mm-hmm.
So that's one way my writers have a say. I also, if there's a question that comes up within the workshop, I'll ask the writer to clarify something on the fly. A good example is sometimes if somebody will submit a piece and let's say it's actually an excerpt of a longer story, but it wasn't noted on the manuscript. And so we're discussing it as though it's a standalone piece. And people are like, where's the ending? That's where I'll step in and say, hey, Lisa, just to clarify, is this a standalone piece?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then finally, at the end of every workshop session, I always reserve a few minutes for the writer to take the floor. And so it's their opportunity to speak to anything that's been said, ask any questions that are outstanding, and just to dialogue with the group. And sometimes I think actually within those last few minutes is where the most interesting parts of the workshop come, because sometimes that's where we learn, the background for why somebody made a certain craft decision, or what their ultimate goal was, or how this piece fits within their larger book length work.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's a really nice model. I just love that idea, because I do that too with folks asking the writer to just, take notes and listen and consider questions, and maybe, have that opportunity to talk at the end. So I love that, because it's not like you say, it's not silencing them. It's just having them, listen and consider and take and what they want and leave what they want too, right? It's
sure.
Like all the advice is going to be, you must implement it. It's just something
right.
Yeah, I love.
And sort of going on what you said about the advice and say you must do this or that. One of the other things that I do with my workshop that's very important to me, and I encourage anybody who runs a workshop or who is in a workshop to really think about this and potentially develop it themselves, is I have what I call workshop etiquette, which when I start a class, I'm like, this is basically the constitution for our time together. And it's not really logistics. It's not, you submit 10 pages and they're double spaced. Like, that's formatting and guidelines, and that's something different. But this is really, I think there's 10 points to it at this point, about how we approach our work together. So it's the values that we hold, and sort of how we support one another. And so it's everything from use good video conferencing etiquette to, when speaking about a piece, be specific, don't be prescriptive or proscriptive, give a reason for your feedback, to remembering that you might be reading something that you don't connect with, but you can still find value in it. The fact, I'm trying to think of other stuff that we do. We always start with the positive.
Nice. Yeah. And
instead of saying this is negative, I like to encourage folks to use the phrase, what could be stronger? Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, I really like the idea of like the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. And I feel sometimes in workshops, words are powerful, even if it's a slight difference in how you phrase something. And so to say, this is negative, or I don't like this, that's a fixed mindset. And I feel that the writer sometimes can feel like this piece isn't good. I can't change it. I don't have the abilities. I don't have the time, the talent, whatever it might be. But to say this could be stronger if.
Yeah, for sure.
And then to offer suggestions or open-ended questions, I think is far more powerful and far more insightful for a writer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's also how we couch our language. And so that's something that comes up too in this workshop etiquette that I have. And I know that some of my writers who've taken the class a lot have sat through this every term. But at the start of every class, we sit and we read through it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that is such an important thing. Writers who have not had a critique experience will so benefit from that, because it can be, unless like if the guidelines aren't set down, a writer can be devastated by, like you say, a small comment that wasn't maybe intended to be hurtful, but it's just, like couched, as you say, in certain language that the writer can really take personally. One of the things I always talk about is making sure that we're critiquing the piece and not the writer. Right?
100%.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to help you make it better. We're offering what we saw and read, but also this isn't about you as a writer. We're not making what kind of ensuring that we're protecting everyone's integrity and their sense of self. Right. That
one of the things I always
it
is. I always tell folks too that, a comment or a criticism, not criticism, but critique that you hear is not about you as a writer. It's not even about your work as a whole. It's about this piece of work at this moment in time.
Exactly. And I love,
this is a snapshot it's a snapshot or an artifact. And so we're looking at that, but it's not representative of you or your work or your potential.
Yes. I love this. It's so good. And I think it's so important. And I have seen so often where either in a workshop or a class where there's sort of no setup. It's just here you go critique this. And there's
Hmm.
no guidelines and not even really a sense of what critiquing is about or
Sure.
what the writer should be thinking or the reader should be thinking about as they're reading. So I love that you have guidelines and questions.
Right.
It really
Yeah, I
helps most
also
people.
at the start of every term I provide my writers with a rubric, things to notice in prose, things to notice in poetry, and it just breaks down craft elements very basically.
Yeah.
And I tend to find that folks, when they're new to the class, especially if they haven't taken a workshop before or critique class before, tend to lean on it pretty heavily, which is great because it gives us a common language to talk about a piece. And as folks get more comfortable, their responses become a little more freeform or organic, and that's great too.
Yes. But that's awesome because if you have folks coming back over and over again, they
Mhm.
are more confident. They are know what they're
100%.
looking
Yep.
for. And then the new ones are really learning from their experience too.
Yep.
So it's that nice effort between the group to kind of show how it's done and kind of what's
Mhm.
acceptable. And, if you're new at it, it can be intimidating to even give critique to somebody else's work because
Sure.
or
Yep.
receiving it can be very like scary. Like I know folks don't always want to
Absolutely.
share their work. They may not have shown
Yeah.
anyone for a long time or ever, even
Hmm.
maybe their mom or their partner.
Yeah. Speaking to that point too, I like to begin every workshop with folks bringing a piece in and just reading it aloud to the group with no critique or criticism. I approach it as more of a literary salon where we're just appreciating and listening
Yeah.
because it allows people the opportunity to ground themselves, to read their work aloud, to make that shift from, this is something that I work on privately or that I might only share with people who already know me to something that they share with the group. And so then, during the second, third, fourth class, whenever their work is up for review, I tend to find that people are a lot more comfortable because they've had the opportunity to share their voice with the group before there was anything at stake, so to speak.
Yes, exactly. And it's sort of a team building exercise, right? A bunch of new people
100%. Yeah.
start to feel like, okay, we're all feeling maybe a little bit nervous about this, and it's okay, and we're going to get it
Hmm.
together. And so the
Yep.
next time feels a little bit more comfortable and it gets better.
Sure.
What a great idea. I'd like to be in your critique group. This sounds fun.
We always have space. And anybody is welcome to check out my
So,
website and see when we're enrolling for our next class.
so how about the more one-on-one book coaching? How is that a little different for you? What does that look like?
Sure. So it's a little different in the sense, first of all, that there's not a group critique. But the way that I talk to writers and work with writers is largely the same. Focusing on the positive first, because every piece of work has merit. And then talking about what could be stronger using very specific craft-based instruction to help folks move their work forward. One of the things that I like to do when I coach writers too, that's a little bit different, is I always start our conversations with asking what success means to them. So in a larger, broader sense, but also specifically for the piece of work that they're writing right now. Because I think sometimes writers don't realize that success doesn't have to be a New York Times best-selling book that was published by one of the big five and is, Jenna's book club read for February or whatever it is. Success could be finishing a draft. Success could be self-publishing. Success could be having the confidence to share your work with a family member who you haven't previously. Success could be reading aloud at a local open mic night. It could be engaging with writers you love on Substack.
Yeah.
And so I like to have those conversations with writers so we can have these definitions of what success is to them and set up sort of goalposts along the way to make sure that we're working towards them. So it's not just about the work, the pages. It's also about the process.
I totally love that. That's
And that process, I think, is what I focus more on with coaching. And, I would love to do it in a workshop, and I can do a little bit of it, but that individual development of a writer, of taking somebody from, I'm confused, I don't know what to do, this draft isn't working, or I have this idea, or whatever they start, and helping them move towards that identity of being a writer and whatever that success is for their piece. And doing that over the longer term. And that's a difference sort of in the philosophy between a group class, a workshop, and coaching.
Yeah.
But I would say the on the ground feedback that I provide on pages and on, sort of the nuts and bolts stuff is pretty similar.
For sure.
I have some coaching clients right now who are workshop students, folks who are taking pieces and putting them into book length works. And so in a lot of the notes that I write to them, I say, this will largely look like what you get from me in the workshop, only it's going to be more extensive. And we're also going to focus on, your process. And so the difference too is when I coach, I like to I tend to break things down into threes. A lot of the writing prompts I do, it's for whatever reason, the rule of three seems to be where my brain goes. And so from my coaching, I tend to break it down into what I sort of call the three Ps, which is your pages. So your actual manuscript, what's going on the page, your process, so your writing process, how that's going, and your project. So the larger project that everything is a part of. And so that's more project management and deadlines and, when do you want to finish this through the longer term stuff. And so the workshop very much focuses on the pages.
Right.
With a little bit of process thrown in.
Right.
But coaching is the project, the pages, and the process sort of all rolled together.
That's a nice way of framing it too, just thinking of it, because it's really so much more than even writing those pages and giving feedback. It really is a supporting that person and showing them how they can get to those goalposts. And I love the idea of thinking about what success means, because it's so different for everyone. And some people are just so thrilled to just write, and they're not thinking about
100%. Yeah.
Right. Like, and that for them is like learning craft. And I really appreciate that because, as a writer, there's so much to learn about craft, especially when you're really early on. And every project has its own new problems.
100%. Yeah.
So I just love the idea that you have that conversation really early on, and folks will, kind of, baby step it. And then, as we do, we move our goalposts a little farther as we
100%. Yep.
So it's great. Can we talk about your writing? You just had a book come out in February.
I did. Yep.
Can you tell us about it?
Sure. So it is a literary fiction novel with sort of a speculative twist thrown in. A lot of my writing tends to involve like a little bit of an element of the supernatural, ghosts, urban legends, that kind of stuff. And so this book is no different. And it's about a family of siblings, 5 estranged siblings who have to return to their small town, Pennsylvania home to deal with the death of their father. And so in returning home, they confront each other, their father's sort of violent, confusing legacy, and the ghost of one of their other brothers who died as a child.
Okay.
So it's not scary. It's a haunting without the jump scares, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
So I like writing with a little bit of a speculative bent, because I feel like those fantastical elements often can reveal a lot about character, society, relationships in a way that realistic fiction can't.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so great.
So yeah, that's kind of the novel. It took me probably 10 years from start to finish.
Yeah.
There were some pauses in between there, where I didn't work on it for a while, but it's something that I'm really proud of. It's my first novel. So it's my debut, and it's funny because I say it's my debut and it makes it sound like it's brand spanking new, even though I've been working on it so long.
Right.
So, I hear you're new. I know. So folks, and they're like, oh, you're a new voice. And you're like, well, not really. It's just you haven't heard it before.
Which is not for a long time.
Yeah. Which is not to say that I haven't published before, but I've worked in shorter pieces and things like that previously. So
yeah. So first book length and everything else previously was short pieces. And I think that's how you can hone your craft too, is by
100%
short and submitting those things and
sure.
all of that frustration about whether or not something gets picked up or published or sending it out again. And I think that's all the process, right? We have to learn how to,
for sure.
Like, rejection is a big piece, but then when you get that win, it's like quite exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Were there any early on, were there any wins that you had that said to you, okay, this is great. I'm on the right track. I want to keep writing?
Do you mean for this novel specifically or just
Or
in
anything you're
general?
writing, maybe anything, even your
I
short
mean,
pieces.
sure. So like I started writing before I could write. I would draw pictures of stories and I it's so embarrassing, but I used to like write stories and give them to people as gifts for Christmas
Yes.
or like
So
little
great.
poetry collections, like writing on my mom's typewriter from college. Like I would go and I would sit and that's how I would spend a Saturday afternoon at age 8. So
Yes.
I've always been writing and I was always really encouraged by teachers. When I was in high school, I happened to live in a town that had a phenomenal youth newspaper.
Yeah.
So our town newspaper, which had a circulation, I think about 100,000 people, households, happened to have one of the nation's premier youth periodicals. So I
Amazing.
was heavily involved in that, ended up interning with them, writing for the paper. So I did a lot of journalism actually as
That's
a young
so
adult,
good. An
which
amazing opportunity for young
yeah,
people.
it was really, really a great opportunity. I grew up in small town Pennsylvania, but I just happened to live near this really cool thing and I took full advantage of it. And so I had a lot of positive experiences with my voice getting out there, even as a young
Yeah,
person. So I've been uniquely blessed in that. And that really helped to build my confidence, in
absolutely.
the sense that my voice was important. It mattered. I had stories and perspectives that were worth sharing. And then, I got into creative writing as an undergraduate and, did an MFA as a graduate student. And, as I got more into the creative literary arts, you run into more rejection, obviously, but I do feel like those early experiences sort of helped to give me a buoyancy that
Absolutely.
other folks maybe didn't have, just simply because, I knew that I was good at it. I knew that I loved it.
Yeah,
And I think loving it is far more important than any talent or skill,
for sure.
because if you love it, you'll keep coming back to it, even if it doesn't matter to anybody but you.
Agreed. And then the talent and skills grow as you continue to
Mm-hmm.
complete, right? Like, I mean, as long as you're passionate about it and you want to learn more, I think we just
Sure.
like I do think writing is something we can learn. It does help if you're a reader and if you start young,
Well,
but
sure. Absolutely.
absolutely learn it later. As I think you have some of your students are seniors. They
Hmm.
might be
Yep.
coming
Some of
into it
the
late.
folks who retire and then start. One of my writers who has a background as a software engineer
Yeah.
has been in our group for a while, and just recently, I think it was last weekend, a couple of my writers who are poets had a public reading to launch an anthology that they were both part of, and so it was really cool. It was in New England, so I couldn't get there, but I got some really great pictures. But it shows that I have folks who are retired attorneys, retired professors, retired all sorts of stuff, as well as younger folks who join us who are still working. Um, that's what's kind of interesting about my writing group, I think, is that there's not anybody in it who is a traditionally schooled writer. There's nobody who's gone through an MFA program. Sometimes we have folks who join us for a little bit, but what's interesting is the people who stick with us are folks who are from other backgrounds,
Right.
which I really think is interesting. And I've learned so much from them,
Yeah, for sure.
in their writing, in their life experience.
And they're bringing all of that to the table, right? They're bringing all of their life
Sure.
experiences and what they've been through, and that will just enhance what they're writing about. Like I just feel like, yes, I mean, I guess I do know quite a few writers who have done MFAs or who have really worked on the sort of academic side of writing. There
Hmm.
are so many who have come from it in another angle, and I mean, I think we value
Hmm.
all of that because, I mean, there's nothing to say you can't do it. It's just like,
Sure. It's, I mean, the thing that I really think separates people who think about writing and people who are writers is actually writing,
yeah, for sure.
and taking a studied approach to craft.
That's amazing. Do you have a specific writing routine? Like, are you a person who writes every day, or are you a person who fits it in here and there where you can? How do you make
So
that happen? Because that's a question I
at
get all the
this
time.
point, yeah, it's a question I get too. At this point in my life, I have a preschooler. So it's writing around when her schedule is. We're getting into the phase where she's starting to not nap as much. So I think I'm going to have to shift things too. Realistically, I think right now, too, my book just came out. I just composed a short story for one of the Telephone Satellite Collective games, the third one that's coming out. And so that was the last big project that I finished, was, composing that story and sending that off to the next artist. And so the last couple of weeks, it's been kind of a creative writing lull for me, but I've been catching up on some of my book coaching work. I do always try every day to either do writing or writing adjacent work. And for me, sometimes that writing adjacent work is working on writing prompts or having great conversations with writers about their work. Or even sometimes it's just reading a really good book.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
So I'm always fueling that fire, so to speak, even if I'm not sitting down and composing pages of my own.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I think there are so few women in particular, but perhaps men if we surveyed them, but so few people who actually can manage to carve out time every day.
Sure.
I think we have to let that idea go. And like you say, look at your life and look at what's happening in this ages and stages. When you have young kids, that's
absolutely, yeah.
Scenario,
Yeah, they come first, and that's the reality of it. I mean, I do miss the days where I could sit and write for 4 hours or 6 hours at a shot.
For sure.
But, creativity, I think, changes with you.
Yes.
And it'll fit in whatever. I feel like it's kind of like a goldfish. It'll grow to fit whatever constraints you have to put around it.
Yeah, that's
and so, right now, if I'm working on a story around my daughter's schedule, that's okay.
Yes, for sure.
And, for folks who are trying to write and they also have a job and they also have kids, your writing life will look different now than it might look a year from now or 5 years from now.
Yeah, totally.
And that's okay. And I think for me as a writer, learning that was okay was good too, because it takes the pressure off. Because I feel like in some ways there's so much pressure to write and to write in a particular way and to get the work done in a particular way. And, there are people who, Stephen King's, he writes 2,000 words a day. One of the classes that I've taught in the past is about the habits of famous, successful writers and how we can emulate those or not. And so there's some fun stuff that I do. And then there's some, more serious sort of reflection on your process. And one of the things that I always share with people is the Victorian author, Anthony Trollope. He was a postmaster. And so he had a full-time job. And so he wrote something crazy, and I'm probably wrong on this number, but over 49 novels and various other works. And so the story goes that he would wake up at 3 a.m. and write for 3 hours. And he would write 250 words a minute or 250 words every 15 minutes.
Wow.
And then he would go about his day. And that's how he got all that work done.
Wow. Mind you, he is probably not responsible for childcare or
100%.
Somebody else's laundry. So yes.
What's really interesting about him is his mother was also a writer.
Okay.
And so she fit all that work around being an early 19th century housewife, mother. I think she raised 6 children. Amazing. And again, don't quote me on this. It's been a little while since I checked up on these numbers and this trivia, but it's interesting, and I think that people as writers, you just have to figure out what works for you.
100%. And the idea that he wanted it enough that he would wake up that early to do it. There is a way to do everything if we want it, right?
Sure.
And it's not to say you must do that and then compromise your health or your happiness or you're not getting enough.
Sure. Yeah.
But finding those little ways, I'm such an advocate for, do you have 10 minutes? Do you have 20?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe turn off Netflix. That's my guilty thing is in the evening. I'm like, okay, I gotta to watch something and just hang out. But I allow that too. But also, we can steal time from other things that are maybe less pressing than we imagine they are. Can the laundry wait? It probably can sometimes.
Exactly. Yep.
There's ways to do it. I love this. So you mentioned earlier that community is really important to you, and you've built this lovely community
Yes.
of writers, both where you lived previously and now here and online.
Mhm.
Why do you think it's important for writers to be part of a community?
So I think that I believe I said this before, that writing is a really lonely vocation. It's you and the page. And maybe it's you and the page and your imagined reader or your critic or your mom in your head, but it's all in you. It's just you. And, even people who are like, my characters are my friends or my characters are like people I talk to. The fact remains that it's just you. And to find a community to help you connect with, to bounce ideas off of, even just to talk about your writing process, even if you don't talk about the work at all.
Right.
If you were to just sit down with another writer and be like, how's it going?
Yeah.
What's your favorite place to write? I love having those types of conversations with folks. Because I'm a real student of other people's process.
Yes.
I love it. I find it so interesting which is why I teach that class about, the creative lives of successful, famous writers. And what I notice a lot when people talk about their process is either they love being part of a community or they find that they're lonely in their creative lives. Mm. And connecting with someone on a creative level, somebody who's also a creator like you are, I think feeds your work and feeds your soul and feeds your intellect and creativity in a different way than speaking to your husband, your wife, your mom about your creative work. There's something about talking to somebody who also creates, whether you're talking to a painter or a writer or, somebody who is a chef even.
Right.
There's something about talking about the creative process, however that expresses for someone, that I feel is really important and really sustaining.
Yeah, that's so true.
And so I like in my own life to try to find those moments of connection with people and to encourage writers to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It brings to mind the fact that I have a really supportive mom. She's 91, and a brother and his wife who are very supportive, my husband who's very supportive. But really, conversations about my writing last a minute, like just they ask checking, how's it going? Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no real conversation, and
right.
I don't blame them, right? They're not. Sure. They're interested in supporting me, but not necessarily in the nuts and bolts of like what's happening in my daily writing life.
Right. Yeah.
You're right. When you have that conversation with a friend or another writer, and you really, they understand you in a way that no one else can, who isn't doing the work or who isn't involved in some kind of creative pursuit, and they get it. They get the highs and the lows of it, which is so affirming that, okay, we're not alone in this. So good.
And, I think that's a great thing about podcasts, like yours and others that are about writing, is that is a way to connect with a community of folks who are creating, who are writing.
That's right.
And, I'm also an advocate for trying to find those connections other places too, whether it's a writing group or a book club or attending an open mic night or a reading in your town or supporting a local writers group, even if you're not a participant in it.
Yeah, that's so important, I think. And especially if you're somebody who's starting out and you don't yet have a writing community, like you say, those sort of local events, that's a place to meet like-minded people and maybe put yourself out there, or maybe just listen, and that's okay. You'll start to make connections, and I think it's so valuable. And I think for me personally, I've had such strong connections in my own community here that those writer friends have become really good friends, and I can, have a Zoom call, even if they're not living here anymore. I can have a Zoom call and have a conversation about how things are going. And it fills the well in a way that.
Sure. 100%.
Yeah. I love that. I love that you've created this amazing community for yourself and for others. That's great.
Yeah. I do miss, because a lot of the folks that I worked with previously, they're still up in New England. And so I'm a little distant from it, but I'm also going through the process of finding that community where I live now, which is great. I did a really interesting, author networking Authors Day event at our local library. And our local library is really small. It's like a community center and like a smallish room that's the other side of the library. But there were 12 other local authors from the area, and it was fantastic to meet these folks. I never probably would have encountered them otherwise.
What a great way to do it. And not just to look around and see what other people are doing, but to say, I'm going to create this opportunity for other people.
Sure.
Right. And I always say that too, like if you don't have a writing community, if you don't have a writing group, if you don't have, some kind of a, I don't know, writers guild or whatever you have in your town, create it. Like people will
Absolutely.
They do. There are other people quietly writing in their, little.
Absolutely. I feel like writing in some ways is the most accessible form of expression because the vast majority of us can write. We do it every day. We do it for work. We do it to get by. Creative writing is a little bit more, I think it's rarer, but the fact remains that we all have the skill set to do it. And I think a lot of people dream of writing. They just don't know where to start or how to start, or they have, hangups from a bad English teacher in high school or whatever it might be.
Yeah, apologies on behalf of all English teachers everywhere when we said the wrong things.
Yeah, I had fantastic teachers and I had teachers who were less than fantastic, but, I learned from both.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I encounter sometimes with folks in my writing classes and my workshops is that they had some really damaging experiences that colored the way they approach their work.
Right.
And some of those experiences are from workshops.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I am very cognizant of and talk to folks about is that workshops are fantastic, but they have to be the right fit and it has to be the right time for you to join.
Yes. Yeah.
Because there is kind of a pushback too, sometimes I feel about group writing classes, workshops, because if they're not, I think, done the right way and with the right intention, they can really, really go sideways and be damaging to people.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that your approach is so great because it's so generous and so supportive. And just, I think that's what it should be, right? It should be welcoming and supportive of you.
It should.
Stage you're at. Like you might be new, you might be writing for a long time, lots of different genres. I think that's so important that folks running these groups know that. But also if you're creating your own little group of writers, that you kind of take that on board, that it's not just critique however you want. Like you kind of have to agree to some guidelines and what you're looking for. So
Sure. And, I think that's really the most important thing, that when people are looking for a workshop to join, looking for any writing group, that they understand the etiquette, the attitude, the ethos, whatever word you want to use for it, or the philosophy of that group. Yeah. And make sure that it aligns with your values and with your goals.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because there are different kind of critique groups too. Some are very hand in rough drafts. Some are very, you share off the cuff. And if you're not aligned with what the group offers, there's a pretty big potential for things to go sideways.
Totally agree. Absolutely. Yeah, that's an important point. And it doesn't mean that if you're in a group like that and it's not going well, that another group won't serve you well, or
sure, 100%
not be the place for you. And that's okay.
Yeah.
I've toe in and try some things and see what fits.
Yeah. I've had folks who have come to my workshop who I've discussed it with them ahead of time. And they said, you know what, this feels like too much work, or this doesn't feel like it works for me right now. Right. I've also had folks who joined the group and who felt like it didn't work for them, which is okay. It's.
And we know, like I think about earlier, when we have different stages of our life and writing looks different, that the same workshop a year later or 2 years later could be exactly the fit they need at that
100%.
Time. It's just so dependent.
Mm-hmm. So I always encourage folks, like if you join a group and you feel like it's not working, first of all, I always encourage them to approach the moderator, the instructor, who's ever running it, to kind of see what their suggestion is, to stick with it, for one cycle or 1 month or one term, unless, you feel threatened or your concerns aren't handled. But regardless, I almost feel like it's important to have discussions with somebody you care about, maybe your book coach, your editor, a trusted friend who writes, to kind of deconstruct why the workshop didn't work for you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that when you decide, if you decide that you'd like to pursue a group again in the future, you know what to look for. Because if you leave a group because there was one person who was overly critical because you were a poet and this group was primarily prose writers, well, maybe you should be looking for a single genre group. Mm-hmm. Or, if you were the only male in a group of women, then maybe you should be looking for a group that is a little more mixed gender or single gender.
Right.
And so to kind of understand, sometimes workshops, emotions get really high.
That's true.
Writing is vulnerable and the things that people write about are vulnerable. And sometimes there's a lot of trauma or emotion. And, I think letting things cool off and then kind of going back and doing that deconstruction to figure out, well, what happened here that didn't work for me?
Yeah.
And hone in on it just so that you know. Mm-hmm. And, that might even be feedback that you could offer to the instructor to say, hey, I really felt like 45 pages of work handed in every week. It's just a lot. Thanks for your time. Just wanted to give you that feedback, or whatever it might be.
Yes, that's fair. So do you have, this is a big question. Do you have any advice perhaps to newer writers? Whether it's about, there's been a lot about workshop, but anything about process or writing, what would you tell somebody who's like just wanting to write, but maybe are not quite yet jumping in?
Sure. There's two main things really. And the first being that, three, I guess. The first is finding community where we began.
Yes.
The second is to finish your first draft.
Love that.
Do the dirty first draft. You have to finish the bridge so you can walk across it and then you can polish. One of the biggest, and I hesitate to use the word mistakes because I don't feel like there's ever mistakes creatively. It's all part of the process. But one of the biggest pitfalls that I ran into with my novel, To Die is Different Than Supposed, is that I spent a lot of time polishing at the start. I say that the best piece of writing advice that I didn't take was from one of my mentors at grad school, fantastic novelist, William Lychak. And he said, you have to finish the first draft. Yeah. You have to touch bottom.
Yeah.
And I didn't take that advice, at least early on. And I think if I had, and if I'd been a little more intentional in planning and finishing that draft, I probably could have cut a few years off my process, but it is what it is. And here I am. So that's a huge piece of advice I share with folks though. And I encourage writers in my classes and my coaching to finish that first draft.
Yeah. I love that. I totally agree. Get that first draft done. And then you have something to play with, something to
Sure.
But you're right.
Absolutely.
I've been guilty of that too. You go back, before you move forward, you're revising and changing. And then half the time, all of that's gone anyways, or you've deleted paragraphs. So you've wasted so much time, but
right.
And I totally love how you say it. It's just part of the process. It's how you got here. And then, you learn from what your last not mistakes, but the process. And then you can adapt that for the next one.
Yeah.
On that note, are you working on another novel? Are you thinking about one? Is one kind of germinating in your mind?
So I actually think my next move is probably going to be to get a short story collection together. Nice. I have a lot of different stories that all sort of deal with themes of identity and hidden voices, sometimes through the lens of a supernatural element. And I think that's kind of where my attention and my inclination is leading. I was going to say, I had one more piece of advice I wanted to share too, before we got too far away from that. And so it's just that the work in your head will never be the work on the page. There's always this differential between what you hope it'll be and then what it is. But when you realize that and you give yourself the ability to just lose that perfectionism, there's so much more freedom. There's a quote from John Steinbeck's East of Eden, which is, now that you don't have to be perfect, we can be good.
Oh, I love that.
And I love that. And I think it's so apt for not just writing, but any creative act. But writing too, because, and I think it ties back into finishing that first draft too. It's never going to be perfect. So if you can try to let go of that the best you can. And I feel like for women, especially, perfectionism is such a strong pull.
For sure.
So I try to remind myself of that.
Yes.
And so, even going into this sort of short story project that I'm kind of circling, I'm going to have to practice my own advice, which is both fun and scary.
Right. 100%. Good. It's been so delightful to chat with you about
You as well.
your book coaching and your workshops and your newly released debut novel, which is so exciting. And we're all
Thank
looking
you.
forward to this short story collection as you move through that creative process yet again. I really want to thank you for your time and thanks for having a little coffee break with me today. That was just so delightful.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. If you're interested in exploring your creativity in a safe and supportive environment of women writers, join us for a weekend getaway on the French River in beautiful Ontario from May 23rd to the 25th, 2025. Learn more at rekindlecreativity.com. Do you have writing goals that you want to achieve in 2025? If you need support, encouragement, accountability, and community, join the Women Writing Circle. We meet bi-weekly to set writing goals and get pages done. Go to Women Writing on Substack and subscribe. Let's create a little magic this year. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to have a coffee break with us at Women Writing. Don't forget to subscribe to Women Writing on Substack. If you like this episode, share it with someone who needs a writing break and a little inspiration. Happy writing! Thank you to Michael Jensen for his original music and editing, and to Mia Jensen for the logo design.